Hello everyone, welcome to this webinar. Today I'm going to be talking about my texture workflow in Mari. I'm going to be discussing my Leviathan Sentinel project. Before we begin, I just want to thank a few people. First of all, I just want to thank David Letondor. He was the guy responsible for the model of Leviathan. So he provided the model, and I was responsible for the UVs, textures, and look dev. I also want to thank Think Tank. So this project was created for my advanced texturing course at Think Tank Online a couple of years ago. And if you want to know more about the school and the course, you can access this website down here. And I also want to thank Foundry for inviting me to do this presentation, this webinar today. And you know, I'm really happy to be here and sharing with you this workflow. So let's jump right into it. Before we begin with the workflow per se, I just want to talk a little bit about the role of a texture artist. And I feel like as texture artists, we have the great opportunity in our hands when we have an asset. It doesn't matter if you're working in your own project or if you're working in a production. I feel like we have the opportunity to tell a story through our textures. Any detail that you add, any scratch that you add to your hovercraft, to your robot, or any scar that you add to your character, it's a story that you're telling, right? And that's something that I keep telling my students, and I keep telling people that ask me questions online is like, don't worry too much about the technical aspect of things, and try to focus a bit more on the fundamentals. You know, like how can you look at real life materials and textures, and how can you tell a story with that, you know? And that's something that I think can help you a lot with any project you have. You know, think about storytelling and how to tell a good story. So this presentation, I broke down this presentation to two parts. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to show you an overview of this project, like all the steps that I went through to finish Leviathan for my course. That's pretty much what I would do, you know, with any personal project that I have. And then after this presentation, all the slides that I'm going to show you, I'm going to go to Mari and then show you the file. And I'm going to show you two different workflows. I'm going to show you the layer workflow that I used. And then I also going to show how I translated the layer workflow into a node-based workflow. Okay? So this is just a timeline. It doesn't necessarily follow this exactly, you know, like, actually I would say that this first stage here is pretty accurate. That's pretty much what happens, how it goes. But then this area here, it's a bit mixed up. Like you don't need to develop these masks before this. It depends a lot on the project. But we're going to discuss this a bit more later on. So this is the final render of Leviathan. This is a few close-ups. And let's talk about the prep stage. The prep stage is when I like to start searching for references, and I think about the textures in my library. This is a very important step, and you probably heard this already. If you're working on any project, doesn't matter if it's texturing, if it's sculpting or modeling, you know, references are essential for a good, realistic if you want to achieve a realistic project. And that's the first step to me, especially for this asset, because I didn't have a concept art. So I kind of had to design the look of it from scratch. So I used the PureRef app. It's not an app, it's a software you can download on this website. PureRef is great because it's like a mood board, and you can drag all these images, and you can add this, you know, lettering here, and yeah, you should definitely use it if you want to, you know, create mood boards and things like that. So I added a few real life references. These are some suits that I found online. My main reference was the Pacific Rim white suit. So this suit was my main inspiration for Leviathan. I loved the scratches, and I found so many good references online for like the different damage states. I also had some different ones here for different materials. Like one thing with references is you have to be careful to not have way too much, because sometimes you can get lost. What I usually do, I have like one, which is like my main reference, and then I have some secondary ones. And I also like to have a CG render as my inspiration for the level of detail that I want to achieve. In this case, I had Chappie here. Chappie, it's a movie, and the robot in this movie was super realistic, and it was done by my mentor and friend Justin Holt. And I really liked the level of detail that he achieved with his textures on this asset. So I just put it here as an inspiration for me. So after I found all my references. It's time to unwrap I unwrapped Leviathan, and this is just like a little graph that I put together, because it's funny, because a lot of people, when we talk about UVs, when they're making UVs for an asset that has, like 5 UDIMs or less, they say, oh no, it's super relaxing. But as soon as they work on an asset that have like 50 or more UDIMs, they know how annoying, and it's a nightmare. Like if you do a proper layout of an asset that has all these UDIMs, it's going to be a headache. But UVs are one of those things that it can be really annoying, but it's also like one of the most important things to keep in mind, because if you spend some time here, you're gonna save a lot of time later on. And here on the side, I put a few QR codes along this presentation. So in this case, I wrote a few articles and tutorials in the past about UVs. So if you scan this code here with your phone, you're just gonna link you to my website, so you can take a look on those articles later on if you want. But I go more in depth about UVs and how to lay them down and think about resolution and how to optimize them. But again, really important. This is just a breakdown of my UV set, my UDIMs for Leviathan. That's how I broke down into materials. A lot of people ask me like if this is like the final layout, if I ever change this. I mean, especially in production, this changes a lot. And in this case, I changed a lot of like the look. In this case, like if you look at the final render, I had these brass pieces, these golden pieces here that I didn't think about them in the beginning when I was making my UVs. So they're not even here. So what I had to do, I had to manually select them, those pieces, and then make them like that. So I had to create some isolation masks later on, which is fine. But as long as you have organized UDIMs, it's easy enough for you to select them. Because if you have automatic UVs layouts, it would be a nightmare for you to select them. So this is something that, especially if you're working in a company, it's really considerate for you to organize the UVs properly and make sure that the texture artists have a good layout to work with. So after we have our UVs, we're going to start baking our maps. This is another important thing. Like, having good UVs will also help you having good baked maps, because it would depend a lot on the UVs and the resolution you have. So keep that in mind. And this is just a few maps that I used for Leviathan. I just put I had curvatures from ZBrush, from the extension pack in Mari, from the diameter occlusion built in Mari, and maps from Substance. I just use whatever I have in hands to bake these maps, and they're really important because they're going to help me drive a lot of the the masks, like the wear masks that we have on the edges, and if you want to add dust to the crevices. So these maps are extremely important. So after I have all this together, I have my UVs ready, I have my maps baked, it's time to assemble my scene. And if you know me, if you know my work, if you've seen my videos before, you probably know how obsessive I am with organization. And this is something that a lot of people say, like, oh, but I'm not organized, like I'm not, I don't have OCD like you do. How do you want me to organize my things like that? And honestly, it doesn't have to be like crazy organized. Like, you don't have to color code everything, but just by keeping naming conventions and things consistent, it's going to help you a lot down the road. And there's one method that I talk about a lot, is the mise en place method. That I didn't create the method. I just put a fancy name into it. It's just a matter of like organizing everything before you start texturing. And I talk extensively about this workflow in a video. So I just put this QR code here. So if you want to watch later, I just show a bit of my workflow in organizing my layers. And the same method can be applied with nodes. And this is what I want to talk about here. In the past, even when I created this project a couple years ago, I used layers. And for the longest time, since I started my career, I was using layers quite a lot. But in for the past year or so, I've been using nodes quite a lot, the node graph in Mari, and I just fell in love with it. It's something that this is like a big debate nowadays in Mari. Like, people that use Mari, it's like, oh, they use layers or use nodes. To me, it's like you should use whatever you feel comfortable. If you can, work and deliver good work, it doesn't really matter what you use. But I would highly recommend you to take a look at the node graph and see if you can get used to it, because it's extremely powerful and it's super modular. If you're working on a team, like, it's super easy for you to share with other artists. But one thing I would say is, when you start assembling your texturing scene in Mari, I would choose your workflow. If you start working with layers, stick with it until the end. Because if you try to switch to nodes in the middle of the project, you're gonna have a crazy headache. And same thing with nodes. If you start working with nodes, keep using nodes until the end. And this is an example here. If a file that is start with nodes, you can keep it quite tidy and organized, especially now with the geo-channels in Mari 4.6. It's super nice and it's easy for you to keep organized. But this is a case where I started with layers and then I looked at my node graph. This is how it looks like. It's gonna be a nightmare. So choose the workflow that you want before it's too late. You can still organize this, but trust me, it's gonna be a nightmare. But later I'm gonna talk a little bit about the two workflows in the end of this presentation, and then you can understand a bit better. Okay, so after we assemble the file, we're ready to start working. There's a stage where I start developing my masks. In this case, again, this is going to depend a lot on the project, but for Leviathan, I started developing my damage masks and dust and dirt and etc. I have here you should talk to your look dev artist. In this case, I was my own look dev artist, so I talked to myself and I said, hey, what's up? What do you need? And I'm like, oh, I might need some, damage, a wear, edge wear mask, and some dust and dirt. And to me, with these masks, I had the opportunity to start telling a story with the details. That's what we talked about, right? Storytelling. And so again, by going back to my references, I try to mimic the main details that I saw on that suit that I talked about. And one thing that I failed a lot in the beginning when I started creating these masks was that I was relying too much on my edge, my curvature masks that I had, the curvature that gave me access to all these edges. And I was like, oh man, this looks awesome. Look at all these edges. I want to, make them all, I want to have wear on every single edge. It's going to look super cool. But then I got some feedback from Justin, who was helping me at the time. And he's like, dude, like, just look at the reference. And when you look at the reference, when you actually look at it, you see that it's not every edge that is worn, like it's just a few areas. You have some main areas of interest, and then the rest you have some relief. And that's something really important that I even put it here. So you have to be careful and make sure to break away from proceduralism. Nowadays we have many tools that make it easier for us to create these masks and these damage masks, but the most important thing is for you to attain to realism and make sure that you create something that feels real instead of just like thinking that looks cool, so that's something that it really it took me some time to develop that. In the end, you can see here I don't have every single edge worn anymore. I only have like some main areas of interest and then some edges that are broken. And yeah, so it's this map was the one that took me the longest to edit and to paint, and I kept editing until the end. That's another thing. Like it doesn't. I'm not saying that you have to finish it and be done with it. You can always go back and adjust as you go along. And this other two masks were a bit simpler, but they also like helped a lot to bring the look in the end. Yeah, so here are some processes. This was just like early on, and like I said, I had pretty much all the edges worn out, but I cleaned that up quite a bit in the end. So after I'm done with my masks, I finally started to develop my main channels, my main maps. So I'm talking about my diffuse or color, spec maps, gloss, bump. Again, it would depend a lot on the asset that you're working on, but for Leviathan, I started with broad strokes, keeping it simple as much as possible. I had, thinking about color breakup and adding breakup to every single map so it doesn't look flat, and adding some extra projections, like some extra scratches and things like that. So this is how they look like in the end: diffuse, spec, glossiness, and bump. And so I spend more time on my masks for this asset specifically because most of it was most of the look came from the spec and gloss maps because it was mainly metals, and I also had some extra maps in the end. These maps they help a lot the look dev artist, in this case myself, to adjust a few things in the shader side if needed. So this is an example of two types of masks. You can have some isolation masks that isolate some specific areas of your model. Isolate. Some people might have a material ID that have different colors for each material, or black and white maps, such as this one. It would depend a lot on your preference, on the preference of the shade artist. And there's also RGB masks that you can create. The good thing about RGB masks is that you can store three types of maps into one single channel. If you scan this QR code, there's an article that I wrote about RGB masks and how to create them. But it's pretty useful. And okay, so after creating all these maps, it's time to start testing. I started testing my maps in V-Ray, and it's time for some feedback and last 10%. And in this case, I was my own, supervisor and lead because I was working by myself. But I did ask my friends for some critiques, and I asked Justin for some notes, and in the end, during the project, he was telling me like, "Oh, maybe you can clean that up a little bit more." And I also asked David. He was the guy who modeled the robot, so he gave me a lot of good inputs about how he should look like. So this is a paint over that he did. As you can see here, he painted the golden color in some areas, and then we had a conversation about where we should put some of these brass areas, and it was really cool to talk with him about that and get his input. Like, as you can see, he also suggested to add the light area, the ring lights in there that I added later on. So it was really important to bring this guy to life. And another important thing is, did you archive your file? Make sure that you archive your file, because I've lost many projects in the past years just because I forgot to archive. And yeah, just make sure you archive your file. And thank you. So this is the first part. And now I'm going to jump into Mari and show you two different workflows: the layer-based workflow and the node graph workflow. I put this slide here. If you want to follow me on social media, this is the QR code. I just add a lot of QR codes. I just found it so cool to add this little thing. But cool. I'll see you guys in the other video.